The billionaire gave the homeless man just 5 minutes, believing security would arrest him if he failed. One rainy afternoon in downtown Chicago, billionaire Daniel Carter watched his company's biggest deal collapse before his eyes. Teams of experts failed, millions of dollars hung in the balance, and time was running out. Then a homeless black man stepped forward and quietly said, "Let me try." Daniel laughed and ordered security to remove him, never imagining that this stranger carried the one solution no one else could see. But what happened next didn't just save a billion-dollar contract. It uncovered a buried injustice, restored a forgotten life, and changed forever the way one powerful man judged the people standing right in front of him. Rain had a way of making downtown Chicago look both beautiful and unforgiving. The polished glass towers reflected streaks of gray across the soaked pavement, while traffic crawled beneath glowing traffic lights. Umbrellas drifted through the afternoon like dark flowers, and every person seemed to have somewhere important to be. At exactly 3:12 p.m., a line of black luxury SUVs rolled to a stop in front of Carter Global Logistics headquarters. People immediately recognized the lead vehicle. Someone whispered, "That's Daniel Carter." Phones appeared almost instantly. Daniel Carter, 58 years old, founder and CEO of one of the largest logistics companies in North America, stepped onto the wet sidewalk with the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly. His silver hair was neatly combed despite the rain. Everything about him projected discipline, wealth, and control. Normally. Not today. Before he could reach the revolving glass doors, his executive assistant rushed outside holding a tablet with both hands. "Mr. Carter!" Her voice cracked. He stopped. "What happened?" "The authentication servers locked us out." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean locked us out?" "The international security keys failed." She swallowed hard. "The signing platform won't recognize anyone." For a second, Daniel simply stared at her. That wasn't possible. The platform had redundant backups, multiple verification systems, emergency recovery protocols. It had been tested repeatedly over the past month. Today's contract, worth several $billion over the next decade, was supposed to be routine. Now every executive inside the building was standing around conference tables, staring at blank screens. Daniel grabbed the tablet from her. Error after error filled the display. Authentication failure. Access denied. Verification loop detected. He looked at his watch. 43 minutes. That was all the time remaining before representatives from the European consortium would legally be allowed to withdraw from negotiations. If they walked away today, years of work would disappear. Stock prices would collapse. Competitors would celebrate. His jaw tightened. Get Ethan. He's already inside. Then get Melissa. Already working. The cybersecurity consultants? All connected remotely. The software vendor? They're on the line now. Daniel inhaled slowly. He could hear voices through the lobby doors. People were running. Someone shouted for another conference room. Someone else demanded backup credentials. The calm image his company had spent decades building was beginning to crack. A light drizzle became steady rain. Employees arriving from lunch paused outside, sensing something unusual. Then journalists began noticing. Not because they knew what was happening, because Daniel Carter never looked rattled. Today, he looked terrified. Inside the lobby, 3 IT specialists surrounded a portable workstation. Monitors flashed streams of code. One engineer wiped sweat from his forehead. "It keeps looping." Another shook his head. The recovery key is rejecting itself. Melissa Green, the company's chief technology officer, rubbed both temples. This doesn't make sense. Daniel walked in quickly. Status. No progress. How long? I don't know. I don't accept I don't know. Neither did she. But this time, she honestly didn't know. The emergency authentication system was behaving as if the company had accidentally locked itself out of its own identity. Outside, across the street, a man quietly watched everything. Marcus Brooks, 46 years old. His jacket had seen better winters. His boots carried the dust of countless sidewalks. A faded backpack rested beside a shopping cart containing neatly folded blankets and a thermos. To most people walking past, he blended into the city, invisible. Another homeless black man surviving another Chicago winter. Nobody looked twice. Marcus wasn't watching Daniel. He was watching the building. More specifically, the people inside it. The pattern. Executives were entering one security door, leaving another, then returning again. Different badges, different laptops. No one stayed at a workstation longer than 2 minutes. He noticed something else. Every decision was flowing upward. Nobody was empowered to make one without permission. He frowned slightly, not because he understood their software, because he recognized something much more familiar. A collapsing decision chain. The rain collected on the brim of his worn baseball cap. A security guard glanced toward him. Marcus nodded politely. The guard looked away. A delivery driver wheeled a cart through puddles. An elderly maintenance worker struggled with a heavy supply crate near the entrance. Without saying a word, Marcus walked over. Need a hand? The man looked exhausted. I've got it. You don't. Marcus smiled gently. Let's lift together. Within seconds, the crate was safely inside. The maintenance worker breathed easier. Thanks. Marcus simply nodded. No problem. He turned to leave. Then he heard another shout inside the lobby. We've lost another backup. Marcus stopped. His eyes drifted toward the giant digital directory mounted beside the reception desk. The executives weren't solving the problem. They were creating more of it. Each new authorization request triggered another security cycle. Each cycle locked another department. He quietly whispered to himself, they're chasing the symptom, not the cause. A few employees rushed past him. One brushed his shoulder without apologizing. Another held the lobby door open just long enough for coworkers, but let it swing shut before Marcus reached it. He didn't react. He was used to it. People saw the backpack, the beard, the worn clothes. They made their decision before he spoke. Marcus had stopped taking it personally years ago. Still, something inside him refused to ignore what he was seeing. He looked again through the glass. Melissa slammed a notebook onto the table. Daniel was pacing. Lawyers checked their watches. Phones rang endlessly. Someone muttered, "If we don't restore access in 30 minutes, the deal dies." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Old habits resurfaced. Observe, identify, simplify. He remembered conference rooms, emergency briefings, executives making panic worse by talking over one another. He remembered teaching companies that systems rarely failed first. People did. When panic spread, structure disappeared. He took a slow breath, then walked toward the entrance. Immediately, one of the security officers stepped in front of him. "Sir." Marcus stopped. "I just need 1 minute. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Marcus remained calm. I'm not asking for money. That's not the issue. I think I know what's happening inside. The guard almost smiled. I'm sure you do. Marcus looked directly through the glass wall toward Daniel. It's not the servers. The guard folded his arms. Sir, it's the authorization sequence. Inside the lobby, Daniel suddenly barked another order. No one touches another backup key until I say so. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Too late. Another manager had already done exactly that. A fresh alarm sounded. Red warning lights appeared across one monitor. Melissa froze. Oh no. Daniel looked up. What now? She answered quietly. We just triggered another lock. Silence filled the lobby. Marcus stepped forward one more time. Not aggressively, not desperately, just with quiet certainty. The security officer moved to block him again. Marcus raised both hands. I don't want trouble. Daniel finally noticed the small commotion near the entrance. His frustration boiled over. What is it now? The guard pointed. This man keeps insisting he knows what's wrong. Daniel barely looked. His eyes swept over Marcus's faded coat, the backpack, the worn boots, then dismissed him completely. We don't have time for this. Marcus met his eyes anyway. For just a moment, neither man spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Traffic hummed beyond the intersection. The city kept moving. Marcus's voice was almost gentle. Sir. Daniel turned impatiently. Marcus said only 4 words. Let me try. A few employees laughed nervously. Someone whispered, seriously? Daniel's face hardened. You've got to be kidding. Marcus didn't move. I believe I can help. Daniel stepped closer. Do you have any idea what's happening in this building? Marcus answered without hesitation. I think I do. Daniel shook his head. No. He pointed toward the sidewalk. Walk away. The security officer reached for Marcus's arm. Marcus allowed himself to be guided backward without resistance. He never argued, never raised his voice. But as he looked once more through the rain-covered glass toward the executives scrambling inside, his expression didn't show embarrassment. It showed concern, the kind of concern that belonged to someone watching a preventable disaster unfold. Daniel turned away. Another phone rang. Another executive shouted. Another countdown ticked closer to failure. Marcus quietly looked at the giant digital clock above the lobby, then at the building, then back at Daniel. Almost under his breath, he whispered, You're solving the wrong problem. No one heard him. Not yet. The rain continued to fall across the wide plaza outside Carter Global Logistics, washing the sidewalks until they reflected every light from the towering office buildings above. Marcus Brooks stood quietly beneath the edge of the entrance canopy for one last moment before turning away. He had learned years ago that forcing people to listen almost never worked. Sometimes all a person could do was offer help and accept that it might be rejected. He adjusted the strap of his faded backpack and started walking toward State Street. Behind him, inside the gleaming lobby, panic was growing louder. Daniel Carter slammed his palm against the marble reception counter. There has to be another way. Melissa Green looked exhausted. We've already exhausted every recovery protocol. What about the offline authorization keys? We tried them. The regional backup? It locked itself after the 3rd attempt. Daniel stared at the error messages covering the main display. Every solution they attempted somehow made the situation worse. Across the room, lawyers from 3 different firms were speaking rapidly into their phones, while assistants hurried between conference rooms, carrying printed contracts that suddenly meant nothing without digital verification. One of the international delegates quietly approached the window overlooking the rain-soaked street. He checked his watch. Then he whispered something to another member of his team. Daniel noticed. His stomach tightened. The clock was becoming another opponent. Outside, Marcus had already crossed half the block. He stopped near a small coffee cart where steam drifted into the cold afternoon air. The owner, an older woman named Evelyn, smiled warmly. "Long day?" Marcus returned the smile. "They all are." She poured hot coffee into a paper cup. "I've got fresh soup too." Marcus reached into his pocket. She gently pushed his hand away. "Not today. You already gave me breakfast. And today I'm giving you lunch." Marcus chuckled softly. "You're going to put yourself out of business." "I've been hearing that for 15 years. She lowered her voice. "You helped fix my freezer last month. I think we're even." Marcus accepted the cup with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As he stood beside the cart warming his hands, an elderly man struggled to pull a folding shopping wagon through a puddle that had formed near the curb. Without thinking, Marcus walked over. "Here." Together they lifted the wheels over the broken section of sidewalk. The older man smiled. "I appreciate that." Marcus nodded. "Take care." People continued walking past. Some looked at Marcus briefly before looking away. Others never looked at all. He didn't blame them anymore. People saw what they expected to see, not what was actually there. His attention drifted back toward Carter Global's headquarters. Even from half a block away, he could see movement behind the enormous windows. Too much movement. People rushing in different directions. No coordination, no rhythm. He sighed quietly. They're still doing it. Back inside the building, Melissa suddenly froze. "Wait." Everyone looked up. "What?" She pointed toward one section of the network diagram. The authentication requests. Daniel stepped closer. "What about them? They're being duplicated. That's impossible. It shouldn't happen." One engineer frowned. "Unless..." He stopped talking. Melissa finished the sentence. "Unless every department keeps trying to override each other." Silence filled the room. Daniel looked around. Each department head avoided eye contact. Operations had submitted emergency credentials. Legal had submitted another. Finance had submitted 2 more. Cybersecurity had launched independent recovery attempts. Everyone had been trying to save the company. Together, they had accidentally buried it. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "So what do we do?" Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. The building's automated voice interrupted. "International conference participants have arrived." Daniel looked toward the revolving doors. 6 executives entered wearing dark coats, still wet from the rain. Their lead negotiator smiled politely. "Mr. Carter." Daniel forced himself to smile back. "Welcome." The man noticed the tension immediately. "Everything all right? Just a minor technical delay." "I see." The visitor glanced toward the frantic IT team. His expression said he understood much more than Daniel wished. "We'll wait." Daniel thanked him, though every second felt heavier than the last. Across the street, Marcus slowly finished his coffee. He could leave. He probably should. Nothing required him to stay. No one expected anything from him, but something deep inside refused to walk away. Not because of Daniel, not because of the company, because hundreds of employees inside that building depended on what happened next. Receptionists, drivers, warehouse supervisors, administrative assistants, people who had mortgages, medical bills, parents caring for aging spouses. A failed contract wouldn't only hurt billionaires, it would ripple through thousands of ordinary lives. Marcus looked back again. His expression softened. Someone has to help. Evelyn noticed where he was looking. You know those people? Marcus smiled faintly. Not anymore. What do you mean? I used to spend a lot of time in buildings like that. She studied him. She had asked questions before. Marcus always answered kindly, but never completely. I always figured you had some story. We all do. You ever think about telling yours? Marcus watched rain slide down the glass walls of Carter Global. Only if it helps somebody. Before Evelyn could respond, a young corporate employee rushed toward the coffee cart, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. He was breathing hard. Coffee. His voice shook. Large. Please. Evelyn handed it over. The young man pulled out his wallet. Marcus recognized the Carter Global employee badge hanging from his neck. The man looked no older than 30. His hands were trembling. Tough afternoon? Marcus asked gently. The employee laughed nervously. If this deal falls apart? He looked back toward headquarters. A lot of people could lose their jobs. Marcus nodded. I know. The employee took one sip. I've never seen Mr. Carter like this. What kind of man is he? The employee hesitated, demanding. But fair. Mostly. He built the company from nothing. Marcus listened carefully. Then he asked quietly, does he trust his people? The employee frowned. I don't know. He trusts results. Marcus nodded almost to himself. That explained part of it. The employee hurried away. Marcus remained standing in the rain. His mind kept replaying what he had seen inside. It wasn't a technology problem anymore. It was leadership under pressure. Panic had replaced structure. Everyone had begun making decisions independently. No one had restored order. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier. A boardroom. Another crisis. Another CEO shouting over frightened executives. Marcus standing at the front of the room saying exactly the same words. Stop solving everything. Find the first mistake. He blinked. The memory faded. His phone. No. He no longer owned one. His office. Gone. His apartment. Gone. His career. Buried beneath headlines that few people even remembered correctly. Yet somehow, the instincts remained. He quietly reached into his backpack. Between neatly folded clothes and a worn notebook sat a weathered leather folder. Its edges were cracked, the corners softened by years of handling. Marcus opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten notes, flowcharts, decision trees, crisis management models. Not because anyone had asked him to keep them, because they reminded him who he had once been, and perhaps who he still was. He gently closed the folder. Across the street, another loud alarm echoed faintly from inside Carter Global. Several employees hurried toward the entrance carrying portable monitors. One security guard stepped outside to speak urgently into his radio. Marcus watched. Then he made a decision. He placed the empty coffee cup into a nearby trash bin, adjusted his backpack, and turned back toward the building. This time, not because he believed anyone would welcome him, but because walking away would haunt him far longer than being rejected again. As he crossed the rain-soaked street, Daniel Carter stood in the lobby staring at the countdown on the conference room screen. 31 minutes remained. Melissa looked toward him. "We're running out of time." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the glass entrance almost by instinct. Outside, through sheets of falling rain, he saw the same homeless man walking back toward the building. Slowly, calmly, with the steady confidence of someone who wasn't returning to ask for money, but to keep a promise no one had allowed him to make. The rain had softened into a cold mist by the time Marcus reached the entrance again. Water dripped from the edge of his worn jacket as the revolving doors opened and closed, swallowing executives, assistants, and security personnel one after another. Everyone moved with the same hurried expression, the look people wore when they believed time itself had become an enemy. Marcus paused before stepping under the canopy. For just a second, he closed his eyes. Not because he was afraid, because he wanted to leave every ounce of pride outside. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about reclaiming his past. It was about preventing hundreds of innocent people from paying for one bad decision after another. He opened his eyes and stepped forward. The same security officer noticed him immediately. "Oh, come on." The guard sighed, already walking toward him. "I thought we settled this." Marcus nodded politely. "I understand." "Then why are you back?" "I'd like 30 seconds. "You already had 30 seconds. "I know." The guard folded his arms. "You need to move along." Marcus glanced past him into the lobby. "I don't need access to your systems. I don't need a computer. I only need Mr. Carter to hear one sentence." The guard almost laughed. "One sentence." Marcus smiled gently. "That's all." Behind them, another black SUV stopped outside. More executives hurried inside carrying briefcases. Nobody looked at Marcus. Nobody ever did. The guard shook his head. "I'm sorry. I can't." Marcus accepted the answer with the same quiet grace he seemed to accept everything else. "I understand." He turned to leave. Then another alarm echoed from somewhere inside the building. Not loud, but sharp enough that several employees froze where they stood. The guard instinctively looked over his shoulder. That tiny distraction was enough. Not for Marcus to sneak inside. He would never do that. Instead, he simply spoke loudly enough for the words to travel through the open doorway. "You're locking yourselves out." The sentence floated across the polished marble lobby. Melissa Green looked up. Daniel Carter stopped pacing. Several engineers turned toward the entrance. The security guard groaned under his breath. Daniel frowned. What did he say? The guard answered quickly. Nothing important. Marcus didn't move. He repeated himself. You're not fighting hackers. You're fighting your own process. The lobby became strangely quiet. Daniel walked several steps toward the entrance. His patience had nearly disappeared. What exactly are you talking about? Marcus met his eyes. The system isn't failing. Your people are. Several employees exchanged confused glances. Ryan Foster, the head of corporate security, appeared from a nearby hallway. At 51, Ryan carried himself like someone who trusted procedures more than instincts. What seems to be the problem? The first guard pointed toward Marcus. This gentleman keeps insisting he knows what's wrong. Ryan barely glanced at Marcus before making his decision. Escort him off the property. Marcus didn't argue. He simply looked at Daniel. You've got too many decision makers. Ryan stepped closer. Sir, I need you to leave. Marcus nodded once. I will. But first, he looked directly at Daniel again. How many emergency authorization requests have you submitted since this started? Daniel blinked. What? Count them. Ryan interrupted. That's enough. Marcus remained calm. I'll leave. But answer the question. Daniel didn't know why. Maybe because there was something unusual about the man's voice. No panic, no desperation, just quiet certainty. He looked toward Melissa. How many? She hesitated. She checked one monitor. 23, Marcus nodded. And how many departments? 8. How many are allowed to submit recovery requests simultaneously? Melissa stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Daniel looked from Marcus back to her. She slowly whispered, 1. Marcus said nothing. Melissa's breathing changed. She opened another diagnostic screen, then another. Suddenly, her eyes widened. Daniel stepped closer. What? She kept staring. The requests. What about them? They're colliding. Ryan frowned. What does that mean? Melissa spoke almost to herself. Every emergency request creates another authentication cycle. Daniel's expression tightened. So? Marcus answered quietly. And every new cycle invalidates the previous one. Silence. One engineer hurried across the room. No. He rapidly checked the server logs, then looked up in disbelief. He's right. Another engineer joined him. Within seconds, both were comparing timestamps. The younger one looked pale. We've been resetting the verification chain ourselves. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked back toward Marcus. The homeless man hadn't moved. He simply waited. Ryan folded his arms tighter. Coincidence. Marcus smiled faintly. No. Pattern. Melissa suddenly began issuing orders. Everybody stop. Her voice echoed across the lobby. No one submits another recovery request. Disconnect every secondary terminal. Only my station stays active. For the first time in nearly an hour, people stopped moving. Phones stopped ringing. Executives stopped shouting. The building became unnaturally still. Marcus watched quietly. Finally, someone had restored order. Daniel looked toward him again. You figured that out? Marcus nodded, by watching people. I wasn't watching computers. I was watching panic. Ryan shook his head. That proves nothing. Marcus agreed. You're right. It only proves where to look. Melissa slowly reopened the authentication console. This time, without dozens of simultaneous requests flooding the system. Several warning messages disappeared. One engineer looked up. Server load just dropped. Another spoke. The verification queue is clearing. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Can we recover it? Melissa didn't answer immediately. She kept working. Seconds passed. Then she sighed. It's stabilizing. Not fixed. Not yet. But stabilizing. For the first time all afternoon, hope entered the room. Ryan still wasn't convinced. He stepped toward Marcus. "How did you know that?" Marcus shrugged. "I've seen organizations panic before." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Where?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the enormous digital wall clock. 27 minutes remained. He quietly said, "You still don't have much time." Daniel glanced at the countdown. The reminder hit him like cold water. Recovery had begun. Completion was another matter. Melissa finally looked up. The authentication chain still won't rebuild. Something else is wrong. Daniel exhaled heavily. So we're back where we started. Marcus tilted his head slightly. No. Melissa looked at him. Why do you say that? Because now you're solving the real problem. Ryan's patience snapped. This is ridiculous. He pointed toward Marcus. You've been standing out here making guesses. Marcus nodded. That's true. You don't know our systems. Marcus looked at Ryan. No, I know people. Ryan almost smiled. That doesn't qualify you to solve this. Marcus didn't seem offended. It depends on what the real problem is. Before Ryan could respond, one of the software engineers hurried across the lobby carrying a printed network map. Melissa. His voice trembled. I found another issue. She studied the page. Her eyes widened again. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. What is it? She slowly looked back toward the entrance, toward Marcus, then back at Daniel. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. I think he may have saved us from making the biggest mistake. Ryan stared at both of them. Daniel's expression changed. Not into trust, not yet, but into something much more dangerous. Curiosity. He looked through the glass doors at Marcus standing quietly in the rain. The homeless man wasn't asking to come inside. He wasn't asking for recognition. He wasn't even asking to stay. He simply stood there, waiting to see whether they would finally become willing to listen. Daniel took one slow step toward the entrance, then another. Ryan immediately followed. Mr. Carter. Daniel never took his eyes off Marcus. Don't escort him away. Ryan looked surprised. Daniel stopped just inside the doorway. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel asked the question that changed everything. Who are you? For a moment, the sounds of downtown Chicago seemed to disappear. The rain, the traffic, the voices echoing through the marble lobby. Everything faded beneath the weight of one simple question. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Daniel with calm eyes that carried neither resentment nor satisfaction. He had imagined this moment more than once over the past 3 years. Not because he dreamed someone powerful would finally ask who he was, but because he had promised himself that if the opportunity ever came, he would answer with honesty instead of bitterness. My name is Marcus Brooks. Daniel waited. The name meant nothing to him. Marcus wasn't surprised. It doesn't ring a bell, does it? Daniel slowly shook his head. I'm afraid not. Marcus smiled faintly. I didn't expect it to. Ryan Foster folded his arms tighter. Mr. Carter, we don't have time for this. Daniel ignored him. What did you do before? His eyes drifted toward Marcus's backpack. Before life brought you here? Marcus glanced down at the wet sidewalk. I solved problems. Ryan let out a short laugh. We all solve problems. Marcus looked back up. I solved the kind that cost companies millions of dollars if they got them wrong. The words were spoken quietly, without arrogance, without drama, simply as fact. Several employees standing near the entrance exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel studied Marcus more carefully now. The confidence wasn't forced. Neither was the vocabulary. There was something unusual about the way he spoke. Measured, precise, like someone accustomed to briefing executives instead of asking strangers for spare change. Daniel asked another question. For what company? Marcus answered. For several. I specialized in organizational crisis management. Melissa Green, who had quietly walked toward the entrance during the conversation, looked at Marcus with growing curiosity. Crisis management? Marcus nodded. I helped companies recover when systems failed, when leadership broke down, when fear spread faster than facts. Ryan interrupted again. Anybody can claim anything. Marcus agreed immediately. That's true. I wouldn't ask you to believe me. Daniel glanced toward the digital countdown inside the lobby. 24 minutes. The number seemed smaller every time he looked. He looked back at Marcus. If what you're saying is true, how did you end up living on the street? The question hung in the cold air. It wasn't cruel. Just honest. Marcus answered with the same honesty. One mistake. Ryan smirked. Everybody says that. Marcus slowly shook his head. No. Not my mistake. His eyes drifted toward the city skyline. Someone needed a person to blame. I happened to be standing closest. Nobody spoke. Marcus continued. The investigation eventually cleared me, but investigations don't travel as fast as headlines. Melissa quietly lowered her eyes. She had seen that happen before. Daniel asked softly, so nobody hired you again? Marcus smiled, though sadness touched the corners of his face. Some wanted to. But interviews become different when you don't have an address. When your suit is gone. When your phone gets disconnected. When your apartment disappears. Ryan remained unconvinced. So why didn't you just start over somewhere else? Marcus looked at him. Have you ever tried applying for work without an address? Ryan didn't answer. Marcus continued. No permanent residence, no recent employment, no references willing to return calls, no transportation. You don't fall all at once. You fall one step at a time. The words landed differently than anyone expected. Not as an excuse, as an explanation. Daniel noticed something strange. Marcus never blamed anyone by name, not once, even now, even after everything. Inside the lobby, another engineer hurried toward Melissa. The system's improving. She nodded. Keep monitoring. Daniel turned back to Marcus. You said the problem wasn't technology. It wasn't. Then what is it? Marcus looked through the glass wall into the building. Fear. Daniel frowned. Marcus continued. When people panic, they stop trusting each other. So everyone tries to become the hero. They make faster decisions. They stop communicating. They create more damage than the original problem. Melissa stared at him. He had just described the last hour perfectly. Daniel slowly exhaled. That's exactly what happened. Marcus nodded. I know. Ryan still wasn't satisfied. If you're such an expert, why are you standing outside instead of inside? Marcus looked at him kindly. Because no one invited me in. Silence settled over the entrance. The answer wasn't defensive. It wasn't sarcastic. It simply carried the quiet truth of someone who had become accustomed to invisible doors. Daniel found himself looking past Marcus's clothes for the first time. He noticed clean hands, well-maintained boots despite their age, a backpack carefully organized instead of stuffed randomly. Little details, the kind people usually overlooked. His phone vibrated. The lead negotiator. Daniel answered immediately. Yes. He listened. His expression tightened. I understand. When he ended the call, Melissa asked, "What happened?" "They're willing to wait." He glanced at the clock. 20 more minutes. Nobody celebrated. 20 minutes wasn't a solution. It was borrowed time. Daniel looked at Marcus again. "If I asked you to come inside..." Ryan immediately stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular." Daniel didn't take his eyes off Marcus. "If I asked, what would you do?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I wouldn't touch your computers." Ryan frowned. "Then how exactly would you help?" Marcus looked toward the conference rooms. "I'd ask everyone except one decision-maker to stop making decisions." Melissa blinked. Daniel said nothing. Marcus continued. "I'd have every department write down exactly what they've changed. No guessing, no assumptions, no interruptions. I'd rebuild the sequence from the first mistake instead of the last symptom." One engineer inside the lobby whispered to another, "That's actually..." The second engineer finished quietly, "How we should have started." Ryan heard them. His confidence slipped ever so slightly. Daniel noticed. "So you think this can still be fixed?" Marcus looked at the countdown. 19 minutes. "I think it already started." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus pointed toward the lobby. Everyone stopped running. Daniel looked behind him. He hadn't noticed. The shouting was gone. People were working, quietly, methodically. The panic Marcus had described had disappeared. Melissa suddenly looked at one of her monitors. Her eyes widened. "Daniel." He turned. "What?" "The authentication queue." She swallowed. "It's rebuilding." An engineer looked up from another terminal. "We're getting successful responses." Another called out. "Departments are reconnecting." The atmosphere inside the building changed almost instantly. Not celebration. Relief. Small, careful, fragile. Daniel slowly turned back toward Marcus. "You haven't even stepped inside." Marcus smiled gently. Sometimes people don't need someone to fix the system. They need someone to stop them from breaking it. Those words stayed with Daniel. Long after the rain, long after the meeting, long after the afternoon itself would become history. For the first time that day, he saw not a homeless man, not a stranger, not a problem standing outside his building. He saw someone who understood leadership in a way few executives ever did. Daniel looked toward Ryan. "Open the door." Ryan hesitated. "Sir." "Open it." Ryan slowly reached for the security panel. The glass doors unlocked with a quiet click. Daniel stepped aside. Not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, simply as one man inviting another inside. Marcus remained still for a moment. He looked down at his rain-soaked boots, then at the polished marble floor beyond the doorway. He almost turned away. Not because he was afraid, Because after 3 years of being treated as someone who didn't belong, crossing that threshold suddenly felt much harder than surviving another night outside. Daniel noticed the hesitation. He spoke softly. You said you only needed one sentence. Marcus nodded. You gave us much more than that. For the first time all afternoon, Marcus stepped forward. The soles of his worn boots touched the polished marble floor. No applause followed, no dramatic music. Only the quiet sound of rain behind him, and the feeling that an invisible door had finally opened. Marcus stepped carefully across the polished marble floor, conscious of every drop of rain falling from his worn jacket. Employees glanced up from their laptops. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence. Some stared openly. Others looked away, as if embarrassed that the man they had dismissed outside was now walking beside their CEO. Marcus noticed every expression. He had spent years learning to read rooms before anyone spoke. Daniel gestured toward the main operations area. This way. Marcus followed without saying a word. Ryan Foster remained only a few steps behind, his posture rigid, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Years of protecting executives had trained him to trust procedures over instinct, and nothing about this situation fit procedure. Melissa Green met them beside the central operations table. Up close, she looked exhausted. Her hair had slipped loose from its careful bun, and several empty coffee cups surrounded her workstation. I'm Melissa. She extended a hand. Marcus hesitated only briefly before shaking it. Marcus. Her handshake lingered for a second longer than expected. Not because she doubted him, because she was trying to understand him. You recognized our decision loop from outside? Marcus nodded. I recognized the behavior. Melissa looked genuinely intrigued. You couldn't even see our screens. I didn't need to. Daniel leaned against the edge of the conference table. Explain. Marcus looked around the room before answering. When people stop trusting the process, they replace it with urgency. Several department heads exchanged uneasy looks. Marcus continued. Urgency feels productive. It usually isn't. He pointed toward 3 whiteboards filled with handwritten notes. You had 3 different recovery strategies running at the same time. Melissa nodded slowly. Actually, 4. Marcus smiled gently. That explains why your system kept rejecting itself. An older network engineer looked up from his laptop. I've worked in cybersecurity for 26 years. He paused. I should have seen that. Marcus looked at him kindly. No, you were trying to solve the problem. You couldn't see that you had become part of it. The engineer let out a slow breath. I suppose that's true. No one laughed. No one felt defensive. For the first time all afternoon, the conversation had stopped being about blame. It had become about understanding. A technician hurried across the room carrying a tablet. Melissa. She looked up. We've restored 62% of authentication. A ripple of cautious optimism spread across the room. Daniel looked toward Marcus. You were right. Marcus shook his head. No, the facts were right. I just happened to notice them. Ryan finally spoke again. You keep talking like someone who's done this before. Marcus met his eyes. I have. Ryan waited. Marcus said nothing else. The silence made Ryan even more suspicious. Daniel noticed. So tell me. Marcus looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering. I spent most of my career helping organizations survive the worst day of their existence. Melissa frowned thoughtfully. Crisis consulting? Marcus nodded. For a long time. Daniel studied him carefully. Which firms? Marcus smiled faintly. I'd rather answer that after your deal is safe. Daniel respected the answer. He turned toward Melissa. What still needs to happen? She pointed at the largest monitor. The authentication chain is rebuilding, but one approval certificate still isn't validating. Marcus quietly walked closer. He never reached for the keyboard. Instead, he stood behind Melissa's chair, studying the workflow diagram projected on the screen. After nearly a minute, he asked one question. Who authorized the emergency legal override? Melissa looked surprised. Our legal department. When? She checked the log. 48 minutes ago. Marcus nodded slowly. And has anyone canceled it? Silence. Melissa searched again. No. Marcus folded his arms. Then your recovery process is waiting for permission from someone who believes the emergency is still active. Daniel looked toward the legal team. A middle-aged attorney raised his hand cautiously. I thought leaving it active was safer. Marcus smiled politely. It was. Until the emergency changed, the attorney immediately canceled the override. Everyone stared at the monitor. Nothing happened. 1 second, 2, 3, then a green notification appeared. Primary authentication restored. For a heartbeat, the room remained perfectly still. No one trusted what they were seeing. Another notification appeared. Secure access verified. Then another. International contract platform connected. The engineer nearest the server laughed first. I don't believe it. Melissa refreshed the dashboard. Every major system came back online one after another. Someone in accounting actually clapped before realizing no one else had. Then the entire operations floor erupted. Not with shouting, with relief. People hugged. Others simply leaned back in their chairs, covering their faces with trembling hands. One woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Daniel remained frozen. He stared at the monitor, then at Marcus. You didn't touch a single computer. Marcus smiled. I told you. You weren't fighting your software. You were fighting each other. Daniel slowly walked toward him. For the first time that afternoon, there was no urgency in his steps, only gratitude. I owe you an apology. Marcus looked surprised. For what? I judged you before I heard a single word. Marcus's expression softened. It happens. That doesn't make it right. No. It doesn't. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. I told security to remove you. You were trying to protect your company. I was. I've made the same mistake before. Daniel looked up. You have? Marcus nodded. I once assumed someone couldn't help because I underestimated them. What happened? Marcus gave a quiet smile. I spent years making sure about I never repeated it. The answer lingered in Daniel's mind. Whoever Marcus had been, he hadn't been an ordinary consultant. The lead negotiator from Europe entered the operations floor. He looked from the restored monitors to Daniel. It appears your systems have recovered. Daniel smiled for the first time that day. They have. We're ready. The negotiator nodded approvingly. I'll inform my team. As he turned to leave, he glanced briefly toward Marcus. He had no idea who the quiet man in worn clothes was. only that several senior executives were looking at him with unmistakable respect. When the conference room doors closed behind the delegation, the operations floor slowly settled into silence again. Daniel faced Marcus once more. "I still don't know who you are." Marcus looked down at his weathered backpack resting beside his feet. "There isn't much to tell." "I think there is." Ryan stepped forward. "Mr. Carter." Daniel looked at him. Ryan spoke carefully. "If we're going to let someone participate in a billion-dollar negotiation, we should at least know his background." Marcus nodded. "That's reasonable." Without a word, he knelt beside his backpack. The old zipper caught for a moment before sliding open. Inside, beneath neatly folded clothes and a worn notebook, rested a weathered leather portfolio. Its edges were cracked, its corners faded by years of careful handling. Marcus lifted it gently with both hands. "I've carried this everywhere." Daniel watched silently. Marcus placed the portfolio on the conference table. "I never thought anyone would ask to see it." He slowly released the worn leather strap. Inside lay a stack of aging documents. Certificates, letters, professional credentials, and one faded business card that immediately caught Melissa's eye. Her face changed. She leaned closer. Read the name once, then again. Finally, she looked up at Marcus with unmistakable disbelief. "That can't be possible." The room fell silent again. Melissa picked up the faded business card with extraordinary care, as though she were afraid it might crumble between her fingers. Across the top, in worn navy lettering, were the words, Brooks Strategic Recovery Group below it, in smaller print. Marcus Brooks, Senior Crisis Management Consultant. At the bottom was a slogan that sounded strangely familiar. When systems fail, people decide whether organizations survive. Melissa slowly looked at Daniel. "I've seen this before." Daniel frowned. "Where?" She searched her memory. "It was years ago, before I joined Carter Global." She turned the card over. "My previous employer brought in an outside consultant after a nationwide logistics shutdown. The board wouldn't stop talking about him." Daniel stepped closer. "What happened?" Melissa looked at Marcus. "They said one man saved a company that everyone else had already written off." Marcus smiled awkwardly. "There were a lot of good people involved." "You were that consultant?" Marcus didn't answer directly. "I happened to be there." Ryan leaned over the portfolio. "I've never heard of Brooks Strategic Recovery." Marcus nodded. "It doesn't exist anymore." Daniel quietly examined the documents spread across the table. Professional certifications, conference programs, letters of recommendation. Most were nearly 10 years old. Several carried signatures from CEOs. Daniel recognized immediately. One letter made him pause. He picked it up. "This came from Hamilton Freight." Marcus nodded. They had a nationwide routing collapse. Daniel looked surprised. "I remember reading about that." The media said they recovered in less than 48 hours. Marcus gave a small smile. They had an excellent team. Daniel continued reading. The letter described Marcus as the most effective organizational crisis specialist the company had ever worked with. Daniel looked at another document, then another. Every page told the same story. Large corporations, major recoveries, outstanding evaluations, respected leadership. Nothing resembled the life of the man standing before him. Ryan crossed his arms. These could be copied. Nobody answered. Marcus wasn't offended. If I were in your position, he looked directly at Ryan, I'd ask the same question. Ryan wasn't expecting that answer. Marcus continued calmly. You shouldn't trust paperwork. You should verify it. Daniel nodded. I agree. He looked toward his executive assistant, Emily. She stepped forward immediately. Yes, sir? I want every company listed here contacted. Melissa glanced at the clock. The meeting. Daniel looked toward the conference room where the international delegation had just begun taking their seats. They can wait another 5 minutes. Emily hurried away carrying several documents. Marcus quietly began returning the remaining papers to the portfolio. Daniel stopped him. Please, leave them out. Marcus hesitated. They're old. They're part of your story. Marcus looked down. I've spent 3 years trying not to tell it. Daniel answered softly. Maybe today isn't about hiding anymore. Those words settled over the room. For a long moment, Marcus simply stood there. Then he slowly nodded. Across the operations floor, employees continued restoring normal operations. The atmosphere had changed completely. People who had been shouting an hour earlier were now speaking in calm voices. Someone brought fresh coffee to the engineers. Another employee quietly thanked Melissa. The building had begun breathing again. Ryan watched Marcus carefully. Something still bothered him. If you were this successful, he paused. Why keep all this? Marcus gently touched the weathered leather folder. Because memories don't ask for rent. Ryan frowned. Marcus smiled faintly. When I lost my apartment, this was the only thing I refused to leave behind. Daniel looked at the cracked leather. Years of rain. Snow. Heat. Cold. It had survived everything with Marcus. A young systems analyst approached cautiously. Mr. Brooks. Marcus turned. The young man looked nervous. I just wanted to. He hesitated. Say thank you. Marcus smiled warmly. You don't owe me thanks. My job was on the line. Marcus shook his head. No. Your company had a difficult afternoon. That's different. The analyst laughed quietly. I hope I remember that. Marcus nodded. I hope you never need to. The young man returned to his workstation. Ryan noticed something. Employees weren't treating Marcus like an outsider anymore, without anyone telling them to. They had begun speaking to him as if he belonged there. Daniel noticed it too. Respect had appeared naturally, not because of Marcus's clothes, not because of his documents, because of the way he treated people. Emily returned carrying a tablet. Her breathing was slightly uneven. I reached Hamilton Freight. Daniel looked up. And they confirmed everything. Ryan remained expressionless. Emily continued. They said Marcus Brooks completely redesigned their crisis response system. Daniel exchanged a glance with Melissa. Emily kept reading from her notes. They also said, she looked up, they still use several of his procedures today. Ryan said quietly, one company. Emily nodded. I called another. Western Transit. What did they say? They asked if Mr. Brooks was available. Marcus blinked. They did? Emily smiled. They said, if anyone ever found you, they hoped you'd call. The room became very quiet. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. I thought. He stopped himself. Daniel asked gently, "You thought what?" Marcus looked toward the windows. "I thought everyone had forgotten." Melissa's voice softened. "Apparently not." Emily continued. "They also mentioned something else." Daniel looked at her. "What?" "They said Marcus disappeared after—" She glanced toward him apologetically. "After a scandal." Ryan immediately focused on Marcus. "There it is." Marcus didn't react. Daniel asked, "What scandal?" Marcus answered before Emily could. "A failed restructuring." Ryan nodded. "So there was one?" "Yes." "You were responsible?" Marcus met Ryan's eyes. "I was blamed." Ryan noticed the wording. "That's not the same thing." "No. It isn't." Daniel looked carefully at Marcus. "Were you cleared?" Marcus nodded. "Months later." "Then why didn't you go back?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Because the newspapers never printed that story." No one had a response. Every executive in the room understood exactly what he meant. Headlines traveled farther than corrections. Ryan looked down at the portfolio again. For the first time, his expression softened just slightly. Not trust, not yet, but uncertainty. Daniel slowly picked up another document. This one wasn't a recommendation letter. It was a training manual. The title caught his attention immediately. Crisis Decision Architecture. He opened the first page. A familiar diagram filled the paper. Boxes, arrows, decision trees, authorization flow. Daniel frowned. "I've seen this." Melissa stepped beside him. "So have I." She looked closer, then froze. Her eyes moved quickly across several pages. "No." Daniel looked at her. "What?" She turned another page, then another. Her breathing became noticeably slower. Finally, she looked up. "Daniel, our current emergency response framework," she placed one finger on the faded manual, "is almost identical to this." Daniel stared at the pages. "That's impossible." Melissa looked back at Marcus. "When did you write this?" Marcus answered quietly. "About 12 years ago." Daniel slowly closed the manual. A strange feeling settled over him. If Melissa was right, then the foundation of Carter Global's entire crisis management system had been standing in front of the building wearing a worn jacket and carrying a faded backpack. Daniel looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I need you to answer one more question." Marcus nodded. "Of course." Daniel held up the manual. "How did our company end up using your work?" Marcus looked at the worn binder for several long seconds before answering. "I've been wondering the same thing." The room became still again. Daniel lowered the manual onto the conference table without taking his eyes off Marcus. "You've never worked for Carter Global?" Marcus slowly shook his head. "No, not directly." Melissa leaned closer. "Then where did this come from?" Marcus rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table. 12 years ago, I was hired by a consulting firm that specialized in organizational recovery. We weren't brought in to run companies. We were brought in after companies had already begun falling apart. Daniel listened carefully. Marcus continued. "My team developed a decision framework that helped executives manage high-pressure situations without creating chaos. He smiled faintly. The technology changed. People never did. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. Marcus tapped one page gently. This wasn't software. It was leadership. Ryan spoke quietly. And companies paid for this? Marcus nodded. They paid because confusion is expensive. Daniel flipped through several pages. Every section felt strangely familiar. Escalation protocols, decision authority, communication flow, emergency recovery sequencing. He looked toward Melissa. When did we adopt our current framework? Melissa thought for a moment. About 10 years ago. Long before I joined. Daniel looked toward Emily. Can legal pull our historical implementation records? Emily nodded immediately. I'll contact archives. She hurried toward her office. Marcus quietly began closing the portfolio again. Daniel noticed. Please don't. Marcus looked puzzled. I don't want to make this about me. Daniel answered honestly. I think it already is. Marcus looked around the operations floor. Employees had returned to work. Phones rang again. Computer screens showed green status indicators instead of warning messages. The crisis had passed. For everyone except him. Ryan broke the silence. If this framework is yours, someone had to bring it here. Marcus nodded. Probably. You don't remember? Marcus smiled sadly. I spent years trying not to remember business. Ryan frowned. What does that mean? Marcus looked toward the rain beyond the windows. When your entire life falls apart, sometimes survival becomes your full-time job. No one interrupted. Marcus continued quietly. There were days when finding somewhere warm mattered more than remembering old contracts. Daniel slowly sat down. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a CIO. He was thinking like a man trying to understand another man's life. Emily returned sooner than expected. Her face had changed. She carried a thin digital tablet and several scanned documents. I found something. Everyone turned toward her. She projected the records onto the large conference screen. A purchase order appeared. 10 years old. Daniel read silently. Strategic Crisis Response Framework. Melissa stepped closer. Vendor? Emily enlarged the document. The room fell silent. The contract hadn't been signed with Marcus Brooks. It had been signed with another consulting company, one that had acquired dozens of smaller firms years earlier. Ryan folded his arms. So they bought your company? Marcus nodded. That happened. Daniel looked at him. You sold it? Marcus smiled faintly. No. My employer did. Melissa studied another page. Wait. She scrolled farther. There's an attachment. Daniel leaned in. What is it? Emily opened the archived appendix. The original authors appeared. Several names. Then one highlighted line. Primary framework. Architect Marcus Brooks. Melissa slowly looked away from the screen, then back at Marcus. They removed your name. Marcus didn't answer. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Melissa opened another version. A later revision. The authors section had disappeared entirely. Only the consulting firm's name remained. Ryan stared silently. Daniel looked between the two documents. The first version credits Marcus. The second one doesn't. Emily nodded. It was revised before Carter Global licensed it. Daniel looked toward Marcus. Did you know this happened? Marcus slowly shook his head. I assumed my work had simply disappeared. The words carried no anger, only quiet resignation. Melissa whispered almost to herself. Someone erased you. Marcus looked at her kindly. Companies change. So do documents. Daniel's jaw tightened. No. This wasn't an accident. Emily continued searching through archived correspondence. Another email appeared. Internal. Dated nearly 10 years earlier, subject. Remove individual attribution before distribution. The sender's name belonged to an executive who had retired several years before. The room became noticeably quieter. Ryan stepped closer to the screen. Open it. Emily hesitated. It's archived. Do it. The message appeared. Most of it concerned formatting, standard legal language. Then one sentence stopped everyone. Future licensing should reference company ownership only. Individual consultant names create unnecessary dependency. Nobody spoke. Daniel reread the sentence twice, then sheet a third time. They intentionally removed the author's identity. Melissa slowly nodded. So every company that licensed the framework afterward never knew who created it. Ryan looked at Marcus. You never challenged it? Marcus gave a tired smile. I didn't even know. Daniel looked stunned. You built something used by corporations across the country, and nobody knows you wrote it? Marcus shrugged gently. It wouldn't be the first time. The sentence landed heavily. Daniel noticed that Marcus wasn't trying to gain sympathy. He wasn't demanding recognition. He wasn't threatening lawsuits. He simply stated a fact that somehow made it worse. Emily quietly cleared her throat. There's something else. She opened another archived file. This one listed every major corporation that had licensed the framework over the past decade. Daniel's eyes widened. 43 companies, several Fortune 500 firms, airlines, hospitals, transportation networks, manufacturing groups. Melissa whispered, My God. Daniel looked at Marcus. Your work has been helping companies all over the country. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. I had no idea. Ryan watched Marcus carefully. He had expected pride or anger. Instead, he saw something completely different. Grief. Not for lost money, not even for lost recognition, but for lost years. Years during which Marcus had believed everything he had built had vanished forever. Daniel quietly closed the archive, then looked at Marcus. How long have you been homeless? Marcus answered without hesitation. 3 years, and during those 3 years, Daniel struggled to finish the sentence. You had no idea your work was still shaping companies like mine? Marcus smiled sadly. No, I thought it had all been forgotten. No one spoke. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Weak afternoon sunlight began breaking through the clouds, casting pale reflections across the glass walls of Carter Global. Daniel looked toward the brightening sky, then back at Marcus. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't simply about saving a contract anymore. It wasn't even about correcting an old injustice. It was about understanding how an industry could benefit from one man's wisdom, while allowing that same man to sleep in shelters and on park benches. Daniel slowly stood. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Marcus, I think we need to find out exactly who took your name away. Across the room, Ryan stared at the archived email one last time. Then, almost reluctantly, he looked at Marcus with something he hadn't shown all afternoon. Respect. But neither of them realized that the archived email was only the beginning. Because buried deeper inside Carter Global's records was one file that would reveal the real reason Marcus Brooks had disappeared from the corporate world altogether. Emily's fingers hovered above the keyboard. The archive system had switched from active company records to historical storage, a digital vault that few employees ever entered. Files older than a decade were rarely opened unless a lawsuit or government audit required them. She glanced at Daniel. There are over 12,000 archived records connected to the acquisition. Daniel nodded. Keep going. The operations floor had returned to normal, but no one seemed interested in leaving. Engineers who should have been back at their desks quietly gathered near the conference table. Administrative assistants stood in the hallway pretending to organize paperwork while listening to every word. Even the international delegation, now comfortably seated in the executive conference room, had agreed to postpone the contract signing for another 15 minutes after hearing that an internal historical review was underway. Daniel had built his reputation on solving problems immediately. Today, something felt more important than a signature. Emily refined the search. Marcus Brooks. No results. She frowned. That's impossible. Melissa stepped beside her. Try searching by project number instead of employee name. Emily nodded. A new list appeared. Hundreds of technical files, training manuals, consulting invoices, implementation schedules. Then, one folder carried a bright red digital marker. Legal hold, permanent archive. Emily looked surprised. This wasn't supposed to appear. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means someone ordered these files preserved instead of deleted. Ryan leaned closer. Open it. Emily clicked. A warning filled the screen. Executive authorization required. Daniel immediately entered his credentials. The folder unlocked. Inside were only 4 documents. One was a legal memorandum. Another was an executive summary. The third was labeled Confidential Personnel Review. The fourth simply read, Final Recommendation. Nobody spoke. Daniel opened the personnel review first. The room became silent enough to hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. The report described a restructuring project involving the consulting firm where Marcus had once worked. The project itself had been successful. Profits had increased. Operational delays had fallen dramatically. Employee turnover had dropped. Every measurable outcome had exceeded expectations. Ryan frowned. This doesn't match the scandal. It doesn't, Melissa agreed. Daniel continued reading. Halfway down the report, his expression changed. What is it? Melissa asked. Daniel slowly turned the screen so everyone could see. One paragraph had been highlighted years earlier. Internal disagreements have emerged regarding implementation timelines. Consultant Marcus Brooks has objected to accelerating deployment before safety and compliance reviews are completed. Marcus quietly looked at the screen. I remember that. Daniel kept reading. Executive leadership has determined that market pressure requires immediate rollout, despite consultant recommendations. Marcus lowered his eyes. I remember that too. Ryan crossed his arms. So you disagreed with management? Marcus nodded. Strongly. Daniel looked at him. Why? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because people would have been forced to make critical decisions without proper training. Melissa looked surprised. Just like today. Marcus gave a small nod. Exactly like today. Daniel continued reading. Several pages later, another report appeared. This one had been written 3 weeks after the rollout. A major operational failure had occurred at another company using the unfinished system. Financial losses were substantial. Media attention followed. Ryan looked at Marcus. They blamed you. Marcus answered quietly. They blamed the framework. And because my name was attached to it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel opened the next document. The title alone made his stomach tighten. Executive Communications Strategy. This isn't technical, Melissa whispered. No. Daniel agreed. It's public relations. He opened it. The first page contained meeting notes. The second contained media recommendations. Then everyone saw the sentence that changed the atmosphere in the room. Public confidence requires identification of a responsible consultant, independent of executive leadership. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ryan slowly reread the sentence, then another one beneath it. Maintaining investor confidence should remain the highest priority. Daniel looked physically ill. They needed a name. Melissa whispered. They chose his. Marcus remained perfectly still. No anger crossed his face. No bitterness. Only quiet recognition. I wondered how it happened. Daniel looked at him. You never saw this? Marcus slowly shook his head. I wasn't allowed into the investigation after the first week. Ryan looked at the documents again. They made you the public face of a decision you warned them not to make. Marcus nodded once. Yes. Silence settled over the room. Outside the conference room, several employees exchanged stunned glances. One older warehouse supervisor quietly removed his glasses. Another employee lowered her head. Daniel reached the final page. There, attached to the memorandum, was a scanned copy of an email. Unlike the earlier message, this one included several executives. One line stood out immediately. If Brooks continues objecting, proceed without him and finalize communications accordingly. Melissa closed her eyes. Oh, Daniel looked toward Marcus. You tried to stop it. Marcus smiled sadly. I tried to slow it down. Sometimes slowing down is how you save people. Ryan spoke more softly than before, and after it failed, Marcus answered. The headlines came first. The investigation came later. The correction came much later. Daniel looked back at the documents. The investigation's final conclusion sat quietly in the appendix. Only 3 pages. Barely noticed. Primary responsibility rested with executive implementation decisions inconsistent with consultant recommendations. Melissa whispered. They cleared you. Marcus nodded. They did. Daniel frowned. Then why didn't anyone know? Marcus gave a tired smile. How many people read page 97 after they've already read page 1? No one answered. Because everyone knew the truth. Most people never read the correction. They remembered only the accusation. Emily quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Ryan looked at Marcus for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I owe you an apology. Marcus looked surprised. For what? I judged you before I knew anything about you. Marcus smiled gently. You judged what you saw. Ryan lowered his head. No. I judged what I assumed. The words hung heavily in the room. Daniel slowly closed the file. His hands remained on the cover for several seconds. When he finally looked at Marcus again, his voice carried genuine regret. For 3 years, you've been living with something that should never have happened. Marcus shrugged gently. I survived. Daniel answered quietly. That isn't the same thing as justice. Marcus didn't respond. Because deep inside, he wasn't sure justice was even possible anymore. Daniel turned toward Emily. I want every document in this archive preserved. No deletions. No edits. She nodded immediately. Then he looked at Melissa. I also want to know every company that benefited from Marcus's work. Melissa nodded. I'll have the list by tonight. Ryan quietly asked one final question. Marcus, if the investigation cleared you, why didn't you fight harder to get your career back? Marcus looked around the room. At the executives, the engineers, the polished floors, the expensive suits, then toward the rain-washed city beyond the glass. His answer came almost as a whisper. I spent so much time proving I wasn't guilty that one day I realized I had forgotten how to prove I still mattered. No one in the room had an answer for that. And Daniel Carter suddenly understood that saving Marcus's reputation might be easier than repairing what 3 silent years had done to his belief in himself. For several moments, no one spoke. The conference room that had been filled with panic less than an hour earlier now carried a different kind of silence. Not fear. Reflection. Daniel slowly closed the archive file and rested both hands on the polished walnut table. I've negotiated with governments. I've rebuilt companies. I've recovered from recessions. He looked directly at Marcus. But I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. Marcus offered a modest smile. I'm still here. Daniel nodded. That's exactly what amazes me. Ryan Foster leaned against the wall, his arms no longer crossed. For the first time that afternoon, he wasn't watching Marcus like a security threat. He was watching him like a man trying to understand another man. The silence was interrupted by a soft knock. Emily opened the door. The delegation is ready whenever you are. Daniel looked toward the conference room, the billion-dollar contract. The reason this entire day had begun. Only a few hours earlier, he believed it was the most important thing in his life. Now, he wasn't so sure. He turned back to Marcus. I'd like you to stay. Marcus blinked. For the meeting? Daniel nodded. I'd value your perspective. Marcus instinctively looked down at his faded jacket. I don't think I'm dressed for a boardroom. Daniel glanced at the worn sleeves, the patched backpack, the boots still damp from the rain. Then he looked Marcus in the eyes. I invited the man, not the jacket. Several executives lowered their eyes. Ryan quietly looked away. Those words carried more weight than Daniel realized. Marcus smiled politely. I appreciate that, but appearances matter. Daniel answered almost immediately. They shouldn't. Marcus nodded. But today they do. Neither man argued, because both knew Marcus was right. Daniel looked toward Emily. What stores are still open nearby? She looked confused. Sir? A men's clothier. Emily quickly answered. Bennett and Cole on Wabash. They're expecting to close in an hour. Daniel reached into his pocket and handed her a black corporate card. Call them. Tell them to keep the doors open. Marcus immediately shook his head. That's not necessary. Daniel smiled. It isn't about expensive clothes. It's about removing every excuse anyone might use to ignore what you have to say. Marcus looked down quietly. For years, he had avoided accepting help unless it was absolutely necessary. Not because of pride, because accepting too much often came with invisible conditions. Daniel seemed to understand what Marcus was thinking. This isn't charity. It's respect. Those two words landed differently. Marcus slowly nodded. All right. Ryan cleared his throat. I'll go with them. Daniel looked surprised. You don't need to. Ryan shook his head. I'd like to. Marcus glanced toward Ryan. Only an hour earlier, the security chief had tried to remove him from the property. Now he was volunteering to accompany him. People could change, sometimes surprisingly fast. As Marcus picked up his old backpack, one of the younger IT engineers hurried across the room. Mr. Brooks? Marcus turned. The young man held out a folded piece of paper. I know this probably isn't much. Marcus accepted it. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for reminding us that people matter more than panic. There was no signature. Marcus folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his leather portfolio. I'll keep this. The young engineer smiled. I hoped you would. As Marcus, Ryan, and Emily headed toward the elevators, employees naturally stepped aside. Not because anyone told them to, because respect had quietly replaced curiosity. The elevator doors closed. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Ryan finally broke the silence. I owe you something. Marcus looked over. An apology? Ryan nodded. And an explanation. Marcus waited. Ryan stared at the glowing floor numbers. My father worked security, so did his father. I was raised to notice risk before anything else. Marcus listened quietly. Ryan continued. I've spent 30 years assuming that if something looked out of place, it probably was. The elevator reached the parking level. The doors opened. Ryan didn't move. I forgot that people can be out of place without being the problem. Marcus smiled warmly. You're not the first. Ryan let out a quiet laugh. I hope I'll be one of the last. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The city glistened beneath a clearing sky. Puddles reflected streaks of orange as the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds. Daniel's driver opened the rear door of a black sedan. Marcus hesitated before getting inside. He couldn't remember the last time he'd ridden in a luxury car. The leather seats, the faint scent of cedar, the quiet hum of the engine. They belonged to a life that felt like someone else's memory. As the car pulled away from Carter Global, Marcus looked through the window. The route passed familiar streets, a bus stop where he had spent freezing mornings, a church that served hot soup every Thursday, the public library where he often stayed until closing time. Ryan noticed Marcus watching. You know this neighborhood well. Marcus smiled softly. I've walked every block. Neither man spoke again until they reached Bennett and Cole. The boutique remained open despite the late hour. The manager hurried outside before the car even stopped. Mr. Carter called ahead. Ryan nodded. This is Marcus Brooks. The manager extended his hand immediately. Mr. Brooks, we're honored to help. Marcus quietly shook his hand. Inside, warm lighting filled the elegant showroom. Rows of tailored suits lined polished wooden racks. Marcus instinctively slowed his pace. Not because he didn't belong, because he remembered what it felt like to belong. An older tailor approached carrying a measuring tape. "What style do you prefer?" Marcus smiled awkwardly. "It's been a while." The tailor chuckled kindly. "Then we'll start simple." As measurements began, Ryan wandered quietly through the store. He watched Marcus answer every question with humility, never demanding, never boasting, never acting as though the afternoon had changed who he was. The tailor disappeared briefly and returned carrying a charcoal gray suit. Marcus slipped into the fitting room. Several minutes passed. Then the curtain opened. Ryan looked up. For just a moment, he didn't recognize the man walking toward him. The suit fit perfectly. The shoulders sat naturally. The polished shoes reflected the warm showroom lights. Marcus's posture hadn't changed. But somehow, everything else had. Not because expensive clothes transformed him, because they revealed the confidence that hardship had never completely erased. The tailor smiled proudly. "There he is." Ryan quietly nodded. "There he is." Marcus looked into the large mirror. He didn't smile immediately. Instead, he stared at his own reflection for a long time, as if trying to remember someone he had almost forgotten. Very softly, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, he whispered, "I remember you." Ryan heard it anyway. And in that moment, he realized the greatest thing Daniel Carter was about to give Marcus wasn't a job. It wasn't money. It wasn't even justice. It was the chance to see himself again before the world had convinced him he was invisible. Marcus stood before the mirror for another quiet moment. The charcoal gray suit fit perfectly, but it wasn't the fabric that held his attention. It was the man wearing it. 3 years of sleeping in shelters, walking frozen sidewalks, and carrying his life inside a faded backpack had slowly blurred the image he once had of himself. Looking into the mirror now, he wasn't seeing a wealthy executive or a polished consultant. He was seeing possibility. The tailor stepped closer with a warm smile. "Comfortable?" Marcus nodded. "It feels familiar." "I'll take that as a compliment." Ryan watched from across the showroom. The transformation had nothing to do with expensive tailoring. Marcus's posture had changed the instant he stopped apologizing for occupying space. The tailor adjusted one sleeve. "There. Perfect." Marcus glanced toward Ryan. "I don't know how to thank Mr. Carter." Ryan shook his head. "I think he'd tell you the best way is simply to show up." Marcus smiled. "I can do that." As they left the boutique, the city looked different. Not because Chicago had changed, because Marcus had. The evening rush had begun. Office workers hurried toward commuter trains. Streetlights flickered to life one by one. Reflections shimmered across wet pavement as the black sedan pulled back into traffic. Ryan sat quietly for several blocks before speaking. "I've been thinking." Marcus looked over. "About what?" "Today." Marcus waited. Ryan stared out the windshield. "I've worked security for nearly 30 years. I've been trained to evaluate people in seconds." Marcus nodded. "I imagine that's part of the job." "It is." Ryan sighed. "And today I realized something." "What?" "I never actually evaluated you." Marcus looked at him. I evaluated your circumstances. The words hung quietly between them. Ryan continued. I saw worn clothes, a backpack, a homeless man. My mind filled in the rest. Marcus smiled gently. Most people do. I don't want to be most people anymore. Marcus extended his hand. That's a good place to start. Ryan shook it firmly. When they returned to Carter Global, the atmosphere inside the headquarters had completely changed. The panic was gone. Employees moved with purpose instead of fear. Several people looked toward the entrance as Marcus stepped through the revolving doors. A few failed to recognize him at first. Then came the second look, the quiet whisper. That's him. The man from earlier. Word spread through the lobby almost instantly. Daniel Carter emerged from the executive hallway carrying a folder beneath one arm. For a brief second, he simply smiled. There you are. Marcus looked down at the suit. I hope this isn't too much. Daniel laughed softly. It's exactly enough. Melissa approached carrying a tablet. The delegation's ready. Daniel nodded. Good. Then he turned toward Marcus. I meant what I said. I want you in that room. Marcus hesitated. I don't want anyone thinking this is a publicity stunt. Daniel answered immediately. Neither do I. You won't be there as a guest. You'll be there because you earned your seat. Marcus looked around the lobby. Dozens of employees had quietly stopped to watch. Not one of them looked at him with pity anymore. Curiosity remained. Respect had replaced judgment. Emily hurried over carrying a slim leather folder. I organized copies of the historical documents. Marcus looked surprised. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She smiled warmly. I figured they belonged with their author. Marcus accepted the folder carefully. Thank you. As they walked toward the executive conference room, Daniel slowed his pace. I've been thinking about something. Marcus glanced over. What? You never asked me for anything. Marcus smiled. I wasn't trying to get anything. I know. Daniel stopped walking. Most people would have. Marcus looked thoughtfully at the polished floor. When I first walked up to your building, I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about work. I was thinking about the warehouse supervisor who might lose his job. The receptionist, the drivers, the people who had nothing to do with the mistake. Daniel studied him. You don't even work here. Marcus nodded. I know. Then why care? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because kindness shouldn't require a contract. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him. The conference room doors opened. Conversation stopped. Around the long table sat executives from Europe alongside Carter Global's senior leadership. Several pairs of eyes turned toward Marcus. Some looked surprised, others simply curious. Daniel walked confidently to the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, before discussing contracts, I'd like to introduce someone. Marcus instinctively took half a step back. Daniel noticed. He smiled reassuringly. This afternoon, our company faced a crisis. Our technology didn't save us. Our titles didn't save us. Our wealth certainly didn't save us. He turned toward Marcus. A man most of us would have walked past without a second glance reminded us that leadership begins long before a computer is turned on. The room remained silent. Daniel continued. This is Marcus Brooks. He helped us recover our systems. But more importantly, he reminded us how easily organizations lose their way when they stop listening. One of the European executives stood. He walked around the table and extended his hand. Mr. Brooks, it's an honor. Marcus accepted the handshake with quiet humility. Thank you. I only did what anyone should do. The executive smiled. I've spent 40 years in business. I can assure you, not everyone would. Several people around the table nodded. Daniel looked toward Marcus. Would you mind sitting beside me? Marcus paused, then quietly took the empty chair. Not at the far end of the table, not against the wall. Beside the CEO. As everyone settled into their seats, Melissa dimmed the lights and prepared the presentation. Daniel leaned slightly toward Marcus. I may ask for your opinion. Marcus smiled. If I think I can help, I'll say something. Daniel laughed softly. I had a feeling you would. The first presentation slide appeared on the enormous screen. A new chapter of the meeting was about to begin. Neither Daniel nor Marcus realized that before the evening was over, Marcus wouldn't simply comment on the company's future. He would expose a flaw in its biggest strategic project, one that every executive in the room had overlooked. The lights dimmed as the first presentation appeared on the massive screen. A sleek animation swept across the display. Project Atlas, the company's next-generation logistics coordination platform. Daniel stood at the front of the room with the confidence everyone had expected from him only hours earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, Project Atlas will redefine how international freight networks respond to unexpected disruptions. The European investors listened attentively. Several nodded as charts projected growth, reduced delays, and stronger profitability. Marcus remained quiet. He wasn't studying the financial forecasts. He was watching the people presenting them. Melissa explained the technical architecture. The operations director described workflow improvements. The legal team summarized compliance measures. Everything sounded polished. Everything sounded convincing. Yet Marcus noticed something that made him lean back slightly in his chair. Daniel noticed. What are you thinking? Marcus smiled politely. I'm listening. Daniel continued the presentation. Another executive described how Atlas would automatically redirect shipments during emergencies without requiring lengthy management approval. The room seemed impressed. A slide appeared showing colorful decision trees and automated recovery pathways. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on one small section of the diagram. Melissa noticed. Marcus? He looked toward her. May I ask one question? Daniel answered immediately. Please. Marcus stood slowly. He didn't walk toward the screen. He remained beside his chair. When Project Atlas detects conflicting emergency decisions, who has final authority? The operations vice president answered confidently. The system. Marcus nodded once. And if two regional directors both receive authority because communications are delayed? The executive smiled. Our software prevents that. Marcus tilted his head. How? The timing protocol. Marcus waited. The executive continued. It compares timestamps. Marcus remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked another question. What happens if both locations lose synchronization with the central server for even a short period? The room became quieter. The executive hesitated. Our redundancy. He stopped. Melissa slowly turned toward the screen again. Marcus wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He genuinely wanted to understand. Daniel noticed that. So what are you seeing? Marcus walked toward the display. With Daniel's permission, he picked up a presentation pointer. He never touched the computer itself. Instead, he pointed to two separate workflow boxes, these two regional recovery centers. Melissa nodded. Yes, they can both declare emergency control. They can. Marcus drew an imaginary line between them, and both are designed to protect customers. Correct. Marcus smiled gently, which means neither one expects the other to become the problem. Melissa's expression slowly changed. Daniel looked back and forth between them. Marcus continued. If both centers activate simultaneously, each one believes it's protecting the network. He looked around the room, but each one also delays the other. Silence. Marcus lowered the pointer. The software isn't wrong. The people aren't wrong. The design creates two leaders where there should only be one. Daniel stared at the diagram. Nobody spoke. Marcus quietly added, "It's the same mistake your headquarters made this afternoon." The words settled over the room. Melissa immediately stepped toward the screen. Wait. She enlarged the emergency routing section. Her eyes moved rapidly across the decision tree. One engineer whispered. Another leaned forward. No. Melissa took a slow breath. He's right. The operations vice president frowned. That's impossible. Melissa shook her head. No, it isn't. She pointed to two authorization paths. We assumed synchronization would always recover before simultaneous escalation. Marcus nodded. You assumed calm conditions. Daniel looked toward the investors. Several had stopped taking notes. Now they were watching Marcus instead. One of the European executives spoke. If Mr. Brooks is correct, what would happen? Melissa answered honestly. In an extremely rare situation, both regional centers could begin issuing conflicting recovery orders. Would shipments stop? Another investor asked. Marcus answered gently. Not immediately. They'd begin competing. Every location would believe it was helping. He looked toward Daniel. Until eventually, they would begin slowing each other down. Daniel blinked. Exactly what had happened inside Carter Global only hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The room remained silent. Finally, Daniel looked at Marcus. Can it be fixed? Marcus smiled. Of course. The atmosphere relaxed slightly. The investors leaned forward again. One asked how. Marcus walked back toward the screen. He didn't criticize the design. Instead, he complimented it first. The foundation is excellent. Several engineers looked surprised. Marcus continued. You've built a strong system. You've simply given it two voices during emergencies. He drew another imaginary line. Replace competing authority with sequential authority. Melissa immediately understood. Instead of both centers making simultaneous decisions, one would verify, the other would support. No competition, no duplicated commands, no conflict. The lead systems architect quietly whispered, "We actually discussed this 6 months ago." Daniel looked at him. What happened? The architect lowered his eyes. We rejected it. Why? It required rewriting part of the authorization logic. Marcus smiled kindly. Sometimes the longer path is the safer one. Nobody felt criticized, because Marcus never made anyone feel foolish. He made people feel capable of doing better. The oldest investor in the room slowly stood. His accent carried decades of European business experience. "Mr. Brooks." Marcus looked toward him. "I've attended investment meetings for over 40 years. I've never seen anyone improve a project without insulting the people who built it." Marcus smiled. "They've already done the hard work. I'm only suggesting a better road." The investor laughed warmly. "I wish more consultants thought like that." Several others nodded. Daniel watched Marcus carefully. Hours earlier, he had seen a homeless man standing outside his building. Now, he saw a leader quietly making every person in the room stronger. Not by proving them wrong, by helping them succeed. Melissa quickly recalculated the revised architecture. After several minutes, she looked back toward Daniel. "Our efficiency actually improves." Daniel frowned. "By how much?" She stared at the screen in disbelief. "Nearly 18%. The operations vice president looked stunned. "And system resilience increases." Another engineer added, "Maintenance costs fall too." The room suddenly filled with quiet conversation. Not panic. Excitement. Daniel looked at Marcus. "You've just improved our largest strategic investment." Marcus shrugged modestly. "I only asked questions." Daniel smiled. "The right questions." The lead investor slowly closed his notebook. "I believe we've seen everything we needed to see today." Daniel looked surprised. "We haven't finished the presentation." The investor smiled. "I know, but I already know what kind of company I'm investing in." He looked toward Marcus. "Any company willing to listen, even when wisdom arrives wearing worn shoes, is a company worth believing in." No one spoke, because everyone understood the deeper meaning behind those words. Daniel slowly looked around the room, then back at Marcus. The contract they were about to sign would secure billions of dollars. Yet somehow, the greatest investment made that afternoon had cost nothing more than listening. For several seconds after the lead investor finished speaking, no one reached for a pen. No one checked a phone. No one whispered to a colleague. The room remained wrapped in a silence that felt strangely peaceful after the chaos of the afternoon. Daniel Carter slowly looked around the long conference table. Every executive wore the same expression, not relief. Perspective. He closed the presentation on the large screen. "I've spent years believing our greatest competitive advantage was technology." He smiled faintly. "I was wrong." His eyes moved toward Marcus. "It was always our willingness to learn." The lead investor smiled. "That is precisely why we're still here." He reached into his leather briefcase and removed the final contract. "Our board has reached a decision." Daniel looked surprised. "We haven't even finished negotiating." The older man chuckled. "I don't believe we need to." He slid the agreement across the polished table. "We came here to evaluate systems. Instead, we evaluated character." Several members of the European delegation nodded. One woman adjusted her glasses before speaking. In business, unexpected problems reveal the truth faster than planned presentations. She looked toward Marcus. "Today, we watched your company choose humility over pride." She turned toward Daniel. That decision is worth more than any projection on those slides. Daniel accepted the contract quietly. He had negotiated hundreds of major agreements throughout his career. None had ever felt quite like this one. Pens were distributed around the table. Signatures followed, one after another. Within minutes, the largest logistics partnership in Carter Global's history had officially been approved. Soft applause filled the room. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just the quiet acknowledgement of something important finally reaching its proper conclusion. As the final documents were collected, several investors walked toward Marcus. One by one, they introduced themselves. Not because Daniel asked them to, because they genuinely wanted to meet him. An executive from Germany shook Marcus's hand warmly. "You reminded me of my grandfather." Marcus smiled. "How so?" He always believed the smartest person in the room was usually the one speaking the least. Marcus laughed softly. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. Another investor, a woman from Sweden, stepped forward. "I've spent 20 years studying organizational leadership." She paused. "I've never seen someone earn respect so quickly without asking for it." Marcus answered simply, "Respect grows better when nobody forces it." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm going to remember that." Across the room, Daniel watched quietly. Hours earlier, most people hadn't wanted Marcus inside the building. Now, some of the most influential business leaders in the world were waiting patiently for the opportunity to shake his hand. Ryan noticed Daniel smiling. Quite a day. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I thought I was saving a contract." Ryan glanced toward Marcus. "You found something more valuable?" Daniel nodded. "I think I did." Melissa approached carrying her tablet. "I finished recalculating Project Atlas." Daniel looked at her and... She smiled. The redesign Marcus suggested increases projected long-term efficiency by 21% after full implementation. Daniel laughed quietly. "It keeps getting better." Melissa lowered her voice. "That's not the impressive part." "What is?" He figured it out, after seeing a few presentation slides. Daniel looked across the room at Marcus, who was now listening attentively as one of the European executives described supply chain challenges in Northern Europe. Marcus wasn't dominating the conversation. He was asking thoughtful questions, encouraging others to explain their ideas, making everyone around him feel heard. Daniel realized something. Marcus hadn't changed after putting on a tailored suit. He had always been this man. The suit had only changed what other people noticed first. As the investors gradually departed, employees gathered outside the conference room. Word had spread through every floor of the building. The homeless man who had arrived wearing a weathered jacket had become the quiet hero of the day. Yet Marcus seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. A receptionist approached cautiously. "Mr. Brooks?" Marcus smiled. "Please, Marcus is fine." She nodded. "I just wanted to thank you. My husband works in one of our distribution centers. We were all worried today." Marcus listened carefully. "I'm glad everything worked out." She hesitated. "I almost walked past you outside earlier." Marcus looked at her kindly. "You wouldn't have been the first." Tears formed in her eyes. "I'm sorry." Marcus gently shook his head. "Then let today be the last time." She smiled through her emotion. "I promise." Nearby, another employee approached, then another. Not because Marcus had become famous, because kindness invited people closer. Within 15 minutes, nearly 20 employees had quietly thanked him for one reason or another, some for saving the contract, others simply because his story reminded them not to judge so quickly. Ryan watched the scene unfold. You know, Marcus turned. I've spent years training security teams. Marcus nodded. Ryan smiled. I think today you trained me. Marcus laughed softly. I wasn't trying to. I know. That's why it worked. Daniel finally stepped forward. Marcus. The small crowd naturally became quiet. Daniel held a slim envelope in one hand. I'd like a moment. Everyone stepped back respectfully. Daniel handed Marcus the envelope. Inside rested a certified cashier's check. Marcus glanced at the amount. His eyes widened. This is... Daniel nodded. The consulting fee you earned today. Marcus slowly shook his head. I can't accept this. You absolutely can. I didn't come here for money. I know. Daniel smiled warmly. That's exactly why you deserve it. Marcus looked down at the check once more before carefully sliding it back into the envelope. He handed it back. I'm grateful, but I still can't. Daniel frowned. Why? Marcus looked around the headquarters. At the employees, the reception desk, the engineers returning to work, the security officers, the cleaning staff beginning their evening shift. Then he answered, because this afternoon reminded me of something. Daniel waited. Marcus spoke quietly. The hardest part of losing everything wasn't sleeping outside. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't even loneliness. It was watching people with incredible talent disappear because nobody was willing to give them one chance. Daniel listened without interrupting. Marcus continued. I know men and women, living in shelters across this city, who built medical devices, who designed software, who managed construction projects, who taught at universities. He paused. They're not lazy. They're not hopeless. They're simply trapped. Daniel slowly lowered the envelope. Marcus smiled gently. If you truly want to repay me, don't invest in me. Daniel looked puzzled. Then who? Marcus's voice became firmer than anyone had heard all day. Invest in the people everyone else stopped seeing. The hallway fell completely silent. Daniel stared at Marcus. He had expected a salary negotiation, perhaps a consulting contract, maybe even an executive position. He had not expected this. Marcus wasn't asking for his own future. He was asking for everyone still standing where he had once stood. Daniel quietly folded the envelope, then looked Marcus directly in the eyes. What exactly are you proposing? Marcus took a slow breath. The answer had been waiting inside him for years. I think it's time we stop rescuing individuals and start changing the system that keeps overlooking them. Those weren't just the final words Marcus Brooks spoke to Daniel Carter. They were the moment one man stopped asking the world to give him another chance, and started asking it to give that chance to everyone still waiting to be seen. This story isn't really about a billionaire changing his mind. It's about the quiet courage of choosing to lift others, even after life has given you every reason to think only about yourself. Marcus proved that the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who keep opening doors for others after climbing back to their feet. Today, think about one person you've quietly overlooked because of where they are in life, not who they are. If Marcus could see potential in strangers after everything he'd lost, maybe you can take one moment to truly see someone you've been walking past. If this story stayed with you, comment one below. And tell me this, have you ever met someone whose value the world almost missed? I'd love to read your story. Stay with us, because the next story may change the way you recognize greatness when it appears in the most unexpected place.